The fact is, there are two armies fighting for Russia. One under the command of the standard military. The other, the Wagner Group. This is like Blackwater was one of our forces, except much, much larger. And it's in the command of various oligarchs or what have you. And it's a fighting force, but it's not a very good, large-scale fighting force. It gets many of its members from prison. They empty out prisons and they load them into the military, which is good if you want cannon fodder, but not really good if you want to train and discipline people. The appointment of Gerasimov indicates how worried the Russians are about their position. They had never expected the war to go this way. They thought the Ukrainians would rapidly crumble and ask for a peace. It hasn't. And the various commanders haven't been able to really punch into the Ukrainian forces. They've been blocked. So you usually get a new commander, but in this case, you have two armies fighting side by side. It's not clear who commands them. So it could be very disorganized. This history it was used, for example, in Syria. It's been used in special operations to do things, and it's not answerable to the military. It's not clear precisely what political force commands them. And it's a very large force. Right now, it's larger than the army, they say. So the answer is that there's a lot of lack of clarity on the part of this force, reflecting the underlying splits within the Russian government. It's simply a bad army. It's very good at dealing with the Syrian village. It's terrible in doing that, the bloodshed. But have an army is not individuals fighting. It's a ballet of a large force maneuvering. And the commanders don't have any experience in that kind of level of fighting. The soldiers aren't trained with the discipline of precisely following orders. And so the answer is that we'll see, but there's nothing in the past of the Wagner Group that makes it appear that it would be competent in such a large-scale battle and one requiring such precise action. What we're fighting for is to keep the Russians away from NATO's borders. And we have to face the fact that in this region, not just Ukraine, but Russia, is vastly corrupt. Russia is run by oligarchs who have usurped property. The Ukrainians are also from this area. They're corrupt. So if we're looking for moral rectitude, this is a place to go. But if you are saying, look, I don't want the Russians on the border of Poland, I don't want them on the border of Romania, well, then we're fighting for that. So from my point of view, the war is about limiting Russia's ability to reach into Europe and into NATO. In neither side are you going to find moral probity. The Chinese have great economic problems. They have issues with the U.S. naval forces offshore, and they're very far away. I mean, getting troops, getting equipment to Russia overland is difficult. Now, are they going to say that they're opposed to them? No, they're for them. And what little help, moral and otherwise, they can give, they'll give. But they're hardly a factor. This is not about Russia. This is about negotiations opening between the United States and China, and this is a way to hammer the Chinese. Perfectly good idea, but I don't think we should look at this as affecting the Ukraine war. Beijing is certainly concerned. It doesn't affect Ukraine, but the Japanese are the world's third largest economy, and perhaps one of the more viable ones. It has not had a military force since World War II because of the terms of the surrender and the constitution they drew up. But they're in a bad neighborhood. It's not just the Chinese. The North Koreans are there. The Russians are sailing ships in the area. They have to have power equivalent to their economic interests. And so they have decided to go on a different path, which is to say, look, we are the third largest economy in the world. We are a major force in everything else. We're going to have our Navy. And this is, I think, more a signal to North Korea at the moment. But the Chinese are taking it very seriously, too. Ukraine is as irrelevant to Asia is what it can be. But China poses a problem, but it's going away. China is in a massive economic decline. It has internal tensions. And it has one huge problem, which is if it went to war and the United States defeated it, which is highly likely, this would be disastrous for the regime. For the regime to have all these economic problems and enter a war and not win, well, that's probably the end. So I don't think the Xi or anyone else would risk this because they have very little to gain. And it's one thing to look fierce. It's another thing to take that chance. They're not going to. The United States is not engaged in war making. They provide weapons, heavy weapons, to the Ukrainians. Will the Germans do that? Well, they have been doing that. The question on tanks comes in two forms. Firstly, they're offensive weapons. They are designed to carry a military into the heart of the Russians. Germany did not want to be the first one to do this. Did not want to be the first one to give tanks. It wanted the United States to take the lead so it could say that it was merely following NATO, not making NATO policy. The second thing about tanks is that they're kind of out of fashion. They're highly vulnerable. What we did to the Russians in the first days of the war, British anti-tank weapons shattering the force. At this point in history, tanks are very, very vulnerable. Now, everybody has one. Everybody has neckties. But deploying tanks against the Russians, who are masters of anti-tank warfare, may not be the wisest thing. But I don't think that was the primary reason that he didn't want to do it. He didn't want to be the first to do it. He didn't want to lead. He wanted to have cover. And so the Americans gave him cover, and they went on. We do very badly in the wars we decide to start. Vietnam, Iraq. We do very well in wars that are thrust upon us. World War II. So I see the Ukraine war as one that was thrust upon us because we did not want Europe endangered again, because that would draw us into real problems. But the war to really look at, the one that's not happening and not going to, the most important thing in the world is not Ukraine. The most important thing is that the second largest economy in the world, China, its economy is, it's overstated to say collapsing, but very close to it. And that being the case, the Chinese desperately need the United States. The United States bought most of its goods, still does, was the largest investor in China. And China is not going to emerge from its problem unless the United States is willing to do this. If the United States isn't willing to do this, there's desperation in China. But I think there will be an accommodation between the two.